Recording. All right. Welcome everybody to the Busy Moms Book Club. I am Laura Johnson. I am a certified life coach and I help moms live on purpose and with purpose. And so this book club is something that I just enjoy doing. I love books. I get giddy about books, as you'll find very quick. And so this is just one of those ways that we can all come together and we can all talk about books in a very fun environment. You never have to read the book to join. You can always just jump on and learn about the book. And if you want, you can always go back and read it afterward. But we are going to be talking today about the book, The Four Tendencies, which is by Gretchen Rubin, and I'll introduce it in just a second. But I do have to tell you, so normally I'm standing up and I'm moving around and I love that. But this morning, my little 4-year-old jumped into bed with us and was snuggling and then started gagging like he was going to throw up. And I jumped out of bed so quickly that I tweaked something. So we're going to be doing this from sitting down today and being a little more informal as we go. Okay, so if you haven't taken the quiz, so if you go to www.quiz.gretchenrubin.com, or you can just type in the Four Tendencies quiz into Google, you'll be able to find the quiz to find out which tendency that you are. I found that was really helpful going into this book, having an idea of what my tendency was, because knowing that just kind of helped me. Well, first, when I was reading it the first time, I went straight to my section and dove into that and then started reading about the others. So you can kind of bypass a lot in the book and then go and pick and choose some of the things that you want as you go. So we always start with a couple of, this book club is for you, or this book that we're talking about today is for you, is if you are really good at showing up for other people, but you have a really hard time showing up for yourself. Another one is if some people get bothered by the amount of questions that you ask, like you always were that kid that was raising your hand in school, always had a question, or the employee that anytime you were asked to do something, you had a million questions about it. You also know this book club is for you if you get annoyed by someone that seems like they're kind of bossy, but they'll never take your ideas. Or maybe you have been told that you are bossy and you don't really like getting feedback from other people. Like, your ideas are really good. Why would you waste time on anybody else's ideas? And then also the last one is if you push back anytime somebody asks you to do something, even if it's something you kind of want to do, but the fact that they asked you to do it, then you start pushing back. So each of those is a reflection of one of the four tendencies that Gretchen Rubin introduces. And so as we dive into this book, I wanted to start with a small caveat that typically I don't like books like this. And the reason why I don't like books like this historically is the same reason why I struggle with Enneagrams, or I struggle with like human design, or astrology, or any of those things, because I have a thought that sometimes when we learn these things, then or like Myers-Briggs, that's another one, where as soon as we learn these things, we kind of pigeonhole ourselves into, this is who I am, I'm not going to change. And so that's kind of the caveat that I wanted to start out with, is that anytime we are learning something like this, like our tendency, or, any of those other things, that is information that increases our awareness about our hardwired makeup. That doesn't mean that we get to abdicate responsibility for our actions to whatever our tendency is, or, whatever that, our horoscope, or, whatever it is that you are studying. I have so much fun. I will take every personality quiz. I enjoy all of those things. So just to be clear on that, I do love and will take those things. But I don't ever allow that to rule the roost of my brain and cause me to not be responsible for the way I'm behaving and showing up in the world. And so it's important for us, and that's what I really wanted to start out with as we talk about this, is it's important for all of us to understand that this just helps us understand how we navigate and move in the world. And that then becomes power for us to be more responsible for ourselves, and not to ever use it as an excuse on like, oh, like, that's just me, I'm an obliger, or I will always like push back because I'm a rebel, so therefore I choose not to do anything. So that's where I wanted to kind of start with that. The other thing that I'll start with, what I really appreciated, and that Gretchen Rubin, the author, she starts out with in the book, is that she wrote her book, The Happiness Project, which we did on book club. It's been a few months ago when we did The Happiness Project. And she had so much wonderful information in that. And I really left the book like feeling uplifted and knowing I was never going to implement any of them. And she even talks about that in this book, which I appreciated, because she said, for me, it was very simple to do these things. And then I started realizing that not everybody thinks and lives like the same brain that I have. And so then she started to see these patterns. And so that's one thing that I do love about her as an author, as an individual, and something that's very relatable to me, is that she is an observer of the world. And what she did with the Four Tendencies is she took truth that already existed and put words to it. And that makes it really fun as you're studying this, that this was already there, and now we have words to describe it. And so as you're going through and you're reading this, it's kind of fun to think like, what are the things that you're going to discover that already exist in the world, that they're just truth, and then you can put words to it. And that's part of like your creative purpose here on this earth. So we talk a lot about that, in my coaching, and really helping women wake up to their purpose. And so I love that she did that. Like, that is part of her purpose, is to be that observer and to put words to truths that already exist on this earth. So as she talks about the four tendencies, what she says is these are not personalities. These are not things that are shaped by your culture or your family. These are just the way that like your brain is hardwired. And she said you were brought into this world with one of these tendencies. And she said, knowing these tendencies is what allows you to thrive and to help understand the behavior of other people around you. And so again, if you can go to, you can just Google the Four Tendencies quiz, or you can go over to the link in the chat box. I think everybody here has taken the quiz. So that's where you're able to find out which tendency you've come into the world with, how your brain is hardwired. So she gives us four tendencies. Clearly, that's the title of the book. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So she talks about the upholder. She talks about the obliger, the rebel, and the questioner. Now, and I mentioned this in the beginning, for me, I went through at the very beginning and I took the quiz and I came out an obliger. And those, I'm looking at the chat box, those that are on the book club right now live, they're also obligers. So we may start with that just because that's fun, because we all relate to that. And I was very surprised. It's actually the longest section in the book as I was going through and looking for. And so within each of these, she talks about the expectations that we have, that each of these tendencies leans towards. So when she talks about the upholder, she talks about the upholder meets expectations of others and themselves. Now, she said that she is an example of an upholder, which makes so much sense when you've read her book, The Happiness Project, where she decides to do things. She keeps that expectation to other people. She had communicated it to other people. And also, because it was an inner expectation, she decided to do it for herself. So it became very easy for her to implement those things. For me, when I hear that and when I learn about that, that's what I want to be. And I get frustrated that that's not the way my brain functions. typically, and I've learned tools and skills to help me within that, but I get a little jealous. And so she talks about that in the book, how there is no right tendency. As you're learning about these different tendencies, you may see qualities in another one that you might get a little jealous and think that tendency might be better. She said within each of these, and I do appreciate the awareness she brought about the strengths and the weakness to each of these tendencies. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute with the upholders. But yeah, she said there's no right tendency, there's no right way to exist or live in this world. It just is. So an obliger meets expectations of others, but not themselves. Okay. A rebel resists all expectations of others and themselves. And the questioner resists others' expectations, but keeps self-expectations. So as we're going through these, I want you to be thinking of examples on, even if you don't know, you're pretty sure your teen is a rebel. It's so funny, Ansi. So Ansi said that over in the chat box. I'm pretty sure my tween is. So I kind of questioned that, as I was going through on, can we actually know with our kids, or are all teenagers finding their own tendency and existing within that? So I think that's such a good point. I definitely was laughing with my 11-year-old this morning on, do you think you're a rebel or a questioner, as we're sitting there eating lunch before this? And he's like, I don't care. And then turned on the TV. I was like, oh, that seems very rebellish. So it just kind of made me laugh. Okay, so here are the 4 tendencies. What we're going to do is I'm going to change it up a little bit. I am going to start with the obligers, because all of us here live are the obligers. And so I mean, you always know that I am not good at art. So we'll see if I can. Okay. So within each of these circles, there is crossover within each of these tendencies. So although there are 4 tendencies, there are the sub tendencies that exist within each of them. So within the obliger, let me pull up the picture really quick to make sure I've got it. So we've got the obliger right here, as well as the upholder and the rebel. And so we're going to talk about, the obliger is what she calls it, the obliger upholder, and the obliger and the rebel. So let me pull up that section really quick. So anytime as she goes through this, and what I appreciated about this is it did help me understand, some of the way that my mind works. It's basically, I'll do anything that you ask until I just won't. And I'm very abrupt like that in my life. And as I go through this, I'll share a lot more examples of my personal life as we talk about this, just because I am an obliger. So an obliger will always make commitments to other people. They're very, they will always show up. And so they talk about, in what she talks about in the book, is that we will always show up for other people, those expectations of other people. We are really great employees and bosses, and we're really consistent for other people, until it comes to the point where we tip the scale a little bit and suddenly we start to resist. They call it Obliger Rebellion. We'll talk more about that in just a second. And for me, I can see very clearly when that happens. And so I loved having the name for that. But what she goes on to say is that this framework is how we want to make our desired changes. So a lot of times for an obliger, there are things that they want to do to make changes within their life, but because they don't meet the expectations, they don't meet their inner expectations, making those changes are really hard. And what she gives as examples in here are finding external that's not the word she used. Let me see if I can find it. Accountability, excuse me. That's the word I'm looking for. She said, by creating external accountability, that's how we start to move and change and evolve as an obliger, is having that external accountability. But there is a fine line for obligers on knowing when and how and the best way to have that kind of accountability. And so I saw this with one of my clients the other day, as we were talking about some of her health goals. She was working with a nutritionist, and she said that, like, one of the nutritionist personal trainer, she said, one of the things I struggle the most with is I do like the accountability, but she has a lot of tough love, and I am not a tough love type person. And so what would happen is when that external accountability would start to show up, but it was not in the form that spoke to her, it triggered her obliger rebellion to where she didn't want to do anything this person was saying to her. And so that's a perfect example of, like, really understanding and knowing you and the way that you function and are hardwired to know when and where that obliger rebellion will start to flare up. She said, in order to create inner expectations, we have to create that outer accountability. And she said, this can come in many forms. And it's important for you to start finding the right accountability that works for you, just like I mentioned. First, some obligers, and I see this because in order to work with me one-on-one in my coaching practice, people have to pay money. And it's a significant amount of money. And for some people, that is an amazing way, like accountability, they will show up because they have put money on the line. What's fascinating is it doesn't do that for all of my obliger clients. And so for some of them, they're like, it's not like that big of a deal. And which is always very surprising to me because money can be very motivating. Same thing when I look at, like, if there's like an appointment that I'm about to miss, for whatever reason, a sick kid or whatever, I will always figure out what is the cost that I am going to miss and is it worth it? There are certain people that I know if I miss that, it's going to be a financial cost and I will get there. But there are some times where I'm like, oh, it's like $25. It's not worth me stressing about missing that appointment or whatever. And so I can see my obliger rebellion start to show up in that way. She said, it's also important to recognize that as you're creating these accountability systems as an obliger, is that you recognize that when you're teaming up with somebody, that it has to be reliable. And being able to create an accountability partner, for example, with somebody that may also be an obliger where they're not keeping commitments, and then the other obliger starts to show up and neither one of them are keeping commitments, then it's like giving permission for both of you to not listen to your self-expectations. And it's like permission to get out of whatever you're trying to do. And so she mentions, as you're creating accountability groups, accountability partners, it's very important to have something that's more formal. That's also to have something like somebody that is going to show up. So she said obligers oftentimes do better with professionals. She said, for instance, coaches, career coaches, health coaches, life coaches can provide the crucial accountability by setting concrete goals, establishing deadlines, and looking over their client's shoulder. They're paid to do this so they don't flake out. This costs money, of course, but it may also be the key to unleashing an obliger's potential. And so I saw this, a little bit about, I think you both know. So I launched my podcast probably a month and a half ago. And I knew this is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And I've been studying my patterns. So even though I didn't have the name of obliger, I knew my patterns well enough to know that if I were doing it on my own, it wouldn't happen. But I felt really strongly like prompted from God that this year is the year that this podcast is going to launch. And so when I decided to do that, the very first thing I did was I found a podcast coach, somebody that would get on the call with me and walk me step by step through how to go through and create my podcast. Now, there are times where there is mindset coaching, there's action-based coaching. She's teaching me. Sometimes I'm working on things while we're on the call. So this is where, for me, having that professional, having that day, I always knew when I had one piece of that assignment due, she was not the one. She doesn't care if I do the assignment or not. Like it's all for me. But I felt like that accountability, and I wanted to get that homework done because I had created that external validation for myself. And so for me, that really unlocked my potential. And now it's very easy for me to do my podcast and to move forward on that. But that's a very crucial thing for my obligerness on helping me go through that. So she said, the other thing to recognize is that sometimes the external accountability is also looking at, like, you can use certain devices, certain like planners or apps, or recognizing that it can be a benefit of other people. That was also something else with my podcast that was very motivating is I love this. I'm giving this information to my clients, like my program, everything, but I wanted to benefit more people. And so when I was thinking about my podcast, that was something that was very motivating to me, as I wanted to make sure I was benefiting other people. And so it kind of lit that fire under my butt by creating an expectation of others, like others need this information. So then she talks about, and Sarah, welcome in. So we're just going through, most of us, we're talking about the Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. We're talking about obligers right now because those of us were all obligers. We'll go back and reach some of the others in just a second. What I love is that thing where she really talks about this Obliger Rebellion, to where at some point we get so tired as obligers of meeting other people's expectations that we shut down and immediately stop. And I remember there was a time, this was back when I was like 19, 20 years old. I was working at a retail store and I was consistently 30 seconds late. Like, why 30 seconds? I'm not totally sure, but there was something in there that was like always, like I was always 30 seconds late. And I remember sitting down with my manager, and what was frustrating to me was I was the most reliable employee, although I was 30 seconds late. Like, people would not show up to work or show up hours late to work or never call in sick or, whatever. And so she sat down and she's like, corporate really wants me to talk to you about, these 30 seconds. You have like 15 times that you're 30 seconds late. And it was so funny because for me, I was so upset about it, I quit on the spot. So I thought about this example of like, I'm going beyond all your expectations, except for this one area. And like, I was young. I could have been on time, but that's where like that example popped into my mind as I was reading about this Obliger Rebellion, is that it's very abrupt. Like, you will meet other people's expectations until you just don't. And it's always a very abrupt type thing that starts to happen. And so that's, as I was going through this part of the book, that was the memory that came to mind. She said, the obliger expects others to know to stop imposing their expectations without prompting. Oh, that's a different part. Excuse me. I don't know where it went. Anyway, so just be aware of that for yourself, and you can go over to the chat box and share with us if you've ever had that experience where you've noticed your own Obliger Rebellion be triggered and what that was like for you. So at this point, and she also talks about how oftentimes this Obliger Rebellion leading up to it, there's a lot of frustration and resentment because we feel that other people should see the exploitation or the unappreciation of the things that we are doing. And that's when we feel like it's everybody else's duty to recognize that injustice and to change. And when that change does not happen, again, that's where the rebellion starts to click in, starts to like turn on a little bit. And so that for me explained a lot of the rebellion that I have felt in my life, and I appreciated that. So each section, she talks about understanding and then dealing with each of the tendencies. And so when you're looking at this, it's important to recognize if you're dealing with somebody else that's an obliger. She said, making sure that you are providing that accountability for them and also being aware of when they're on the verge of burnout and stepping up to the plate to create that outside expectation. So the example that she uses for the obliger spouse is, hey, you're looking really exhausted. You've been going full steam. I think it's time where you just go take a nap. I will take the kids and you go and do that. My husband's really great at that because I will go to the point of burnout, and I have done a lot better about seeing my own triggers and being aware of those. But now this also gives me some really great information to communicate with him about that as well. But he's really great on, especially now, in my pregnancy, as I'm progressing, I'm like asleep by 8 o'clock every night. So he's really good on like, yeah, I can see you are totally exhausted. You've been going nonstop for the last 12 to 14 hours, go lay down. And so sometimes I won't do that for myself, that inner expectation. I am learning that. But when he says that, I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely need to do that. And then as far as a child goes, they said it's also really helpful to help them. Like, we always want our kids to have that inner motivation, not to be that helicopter parent. But when you have an obliger child, this is my daughter for sure, they work really hard to please us, and making sure that we're always being able to reinforce with praise and follow through is really beneficial for these kids, not from a place of helicoptering and trying to control them, but from a place of love and connection and support. And that's really the best way to deal with an obliger child. So Sarah says, example, I do that when it comes to work and raises. I feel like they should just see what I do and then give me the raise. When they don't recognize, I feel bitter, and then I want to quit. Yes, that is a perfect example. And I can completely relate to that, because for us, like, and I'm guessing you are an obliger, based on that, or maybe you have some overlap. But yes, that for me is completely my experience, in the past, where I just want people to see and recognize me. And they should. Like, why don't they? And so as an obliger, like, learning to speak up and having that accountability to someone else, saying to someone, I am going to ask for this raise. This is how I'm going to ask. I've done that with clients before, like role playing and practicing and creating that expectation to somebody else that you are going to do that, and then following through on that. Nicole says, I do the same. I've learned to speak up for myself more. Yeah. So we understand our obligerness and are able to use that to our benefit. Okay, so that is obliger. That's just one. And we did spend time on that just because all of us on this call, she said that is the majority, not the majority, but that is the largest group of people. So let's go back to upholder. Again, I'm so fascinated by the upholders because they have that inner drive and they meet those inner expectations. And so for me, that doesn't meet those self expectations, that's where I get a little bit jealous. But so she talks about, the upholders really thrive on schedules and routines, and they're really intrigued by rules. They love to execute plans because within those plans and those routines, they feel a lot of freedom. Now, what I wanted to point out here is that oftentimes, and I see this so much in my clients, is that if we fall in a different one of these categories, and say we are looking for help on time management or home management, we may go to Pinterest and find some of the most beautiful schedules, routines. And we think, okay, that's what we have to do to solve this, to be better at our time management, to be better at our home management. And we could be taking an upholder's routine and trying to implement it on us as an obliger. That does not work. And I've seen that over and over in my clients, because then they shame themselves for it not working for them because they can't meet those inner expectations. They can't keep those self commitments. And so what they're doing is using the strength of another group to use it against themselves. And so it's so important to recognize that there is no right way. Like one of the reels I did on Instagram that actually got like a lot of love and a lot of hate was like time blocking, where I like said some myth on like, like you don't have to time block in order to get more things done. Because for me, that immediately triggers Obliger Rebellion. I will always, if I start time blocking, I will push against it and fight against it every single time. Whereas an upholder most likely loves time blocking, and that's where they really thrive, which is great and such a fabulous thing. Just recognize that that is a strength that they have. Don't use it against you if you are one of the other tendencies. Don't use it as like ammunition or weaponize it against yourself. One of the things she talks about, as she is talking about that is a strength. I'm laughing because I try to apply those routines and it just doesn't work. Sarah, I am with you 100%. And I do have a lot of systems that I've created that do work for me, but they look so different. Like I'm sure if somebody else saw it, they'd be like, that's pure chaos. I don't understand how this works for you. And it does. And that's really like what I teach my clients, is to go through and create that system that does work for you. And we're so intentional about that, because there are a million different ways to create systems and routines that don't look like an upholder system and routine. So just to be clear on that. What I love that she talks about is, we see so much of these strengths in the upholders, but there is the weaknesses of the upholders too, which they become very impatient or rigid, or wants everybody to care as much about these things as they do. And they get really frustrated when other people can't follow through to the same extent that they follow through. My husband's a really fantastic example of this. When he decides to do something, he does something. And I'm always like blown away at some of the stuff he decides to do. So he decided to run a marathon. At the time, he wasn't running at all. He had been like a cross country runner in the past, and he just hadn't done it for a lot of years. And then woke up one day and signed up for a marathon. Now that like blows my mind in and of itself. So what he started to do was, to keep these runs and to go and, all of that. And so that was like really fantastic to watch him, really inspirational, is when he decides to do something, he goes for it. But what also starts to happen is when he's in the workplace, she is, Gretchen Rubin talks about the phrase of tightening. So for an upholder, they will become very tight or very rigid with their routines or their plans that they have created, to the point where if those plans need to change or tweak, they become very uncomfortable, and they really push against that. And it's very challenging. They become very impatient with other people. And that's what she describes as the tightening of an upholder. And so when I look at this, for my husband at work, like he will keep deadlines. If it means staying up until 4 a.m. the night before, he will never miss a deadline. Yet he gets very frustrated with his team at times because they may not have that same drive to stay up all night to complete something. Like it's very confusing to him. And so he'll get really frustrated or impatient, not meaning to, but it gets very uncomfortable for him when they don't have that same drive that he does. Same thing where she talks about it's very challenging for them to delegate, because they are the upholders are sure that people will not have that same dedication to whatever it is that they're working on. And so they will hoard and keep all of the work to make sure that it's done correctly. She said, when you're really talking about, you're really talking with an upholder, that's where you want to make sure that you are fostering understanding. She said, understanding fosters tolerance. And fosters tolerance. So when you're talking with an upholder, what you want to do is make sure that you're reassuring them and helping them understand where you're coming from as you're going through something. And she said, because they take on the expectations of others and for themselves, it's important when you're talking to an upholder to let them know that this is not an expectation for you to take on. And so, an example of this is part of my evening processing systems. And I'm checking the time real quick. I realize I'll start moving quicker through these. But part of my evening processing of just the day is I just want to vent. I just want to like bitch and complain to my husband at night. Excuse my language. So in the evenings, what I realized was that for me, that's just like getting stuff off my chest for like the hard things of the day. And I'll just complain, get it all up. And what I realized was what was happening was he was taking my complaining, which I just needed to say just to get it out there. And then I was totally fine. It was just like, I call it like passing the negative juju. Like I just need to get the negative juju out. So what I realized was as I was doing that in the evening, and it was usually before bed, I felt very relieved. And what happened to my poor husband was that he was internalizing all of it as expectations on how he was not measuring up or things that he needed to do. So while I was sleeping peacefully, his mind was spinning like all the stuff that I had just dumped on him that he had created expectations about. And so for me, what I've adjusted, and it was fun being able to see her, put this into words, is that before I complain to him for whatever thing, like processing through the day, I'll always say, I just need to say these things out loud. I don't need you to fix them. They are not your responsibility. And I get very clear on that so that he is not internalizing them as expectations for him. So that is how we work with our upholders in our lives. Okay, so we also have our rebel and our questioner, and I want to make sure that I leave a couple minutes at the end just for questions. So I'm going to move through these really quick. So what I love about where she talks about the rebel, and we're kind of skipping around in the book, but what she talks about with the rebel is they are the voice for change. They will resist all outer and inner expectations, and they put a really high value on freedom, that choice, that identity, that self-expression. And if you do tell them to do something, oftentimes they will do the complete opposite, no matter what. Now, sometimes they do act out of like a sense of love. There's like the sense of mission within inside of them. And they will always rise to a challenge if it's their idea. So as I was thinking about like, who are the rebels in my life? Like I thought about my brother-in-law, where he, okay. So we laugh. If you've ever seen the show Parks and Rec with Leslie Knope, I mean, it's Amy Poehler. I forgot her name there for a second. We laugh that my brother-in-law is Ron Swanson. Like that is him to a T. Like Ron Swanson, this character in the show, he wants to work in the government in order to take the government down from the inside. Like he just doesn't like government policy. Like that's his character. It's really like endearing as you watch the show. It sounds horrible as I explain it, but it is he is such a lovable character. But he is definitely a rebel. Like there is nothing that you can ask him to do where he just doesn't push back and do his own thing no matter what. It's exactly the same way with my brother-in-law. Now, when we're talking about rebels, and this is so important, is I think sometimes from obliger or upholder, we're looking at it on like, that's not fair that they get to just resist anything. But to remember that they have such a critical role for all of us within these tendencies is that they are the ones that are creating monumental change in ways that we cannot. And because of their grit and their ability to rise to challenges, their critical thinking, their independence, they're going to be the ones that move the pendulum of change in ways that we just can't. And so they have such a beautiful gift for that. Now I think about this with my son, and Ansi mentioned this, like she thought her teenager was a rebel. And, as I've been thinking about this with my son, my 11-year-old, he would definitely fall within like the rebel questioner categories. And I don't actually know which one he is at this point. But one of the things is that it does not matter what I ask him to do, he will always push back, well, literally on everything. But what's really interesting is that he does have a very creative gift of creating what he wants. And we often laugh that he's either going to be a millionaire or he's going to be homeless, that we don't actually know which way it's going to land at this point, because he could end up in jail for being like pushing back so much. So we're hoping that he harnesses his rebelness and becomes a millionaire from it. But so the other day, and I shared this on Instagram, and I'll share this last example of rebelness before we move on to questioner. But I was so excited to go to the grocery store by myself and to be, in the store, just walking around. I had like two things I needed to pick up, and I just haven't had a lot of space. I mean, it's summer and the kids have all been home. And so I was excited. And so he kept asking, well, can I go with you? Can I go with you? I'm like, no, you're going to stay home. Dad's going to help you get ready for bed. He's like, okay, well, can I go with you? I'm like, no. Like, he kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Like, he did not, he resisted any expectation I had for myself, of going and doing this thing. And so finally he got to this point where he was like, okay, well, like I was sitting on the couch and I was just about to get up and he started rubbing my feet. As soon as I started melting, he's like, hey, I'll rub your feet for 30 more minutes if I can go to the store with you. I was like, done. like all like reasoning went out the window. Like, of course, if you rub my feet, especially when I'm pregnant, I'm like, yeah, you're gonna have whatever you want. But that is definitely the rebel in him, was don't say no to me or I will find a different way. And he does every single time. And it truly is a gift that he has. When I'm not so frustrated with him, I can see that gift. And so that's what I would really challenge all of us for the rebels in our lives, or those that we may think are rebels, is to look at their ability to change things, even to change us, like our minds as parents, their ability to really push against the norm, and to recognize that they are going to be the change makers for the things that need to happen. I think about the social justice warriors that we have, and so many amazing things have come from our rebels. And so really help them foster and see that. And I know it's tiring as a parent because we are trying to teach them and keep them safe, but allow them, safe places to push back against. Yes, he is quite the negotiator, very much so. I've never seen anybody negotiate like that kid, and he's 11, so he's brilliant. Okay, our last one are questioners. And when I think about this, and this is, with my oldest, I'm really not sure if he is a rebel or a questioner, but they do overlap, so he could be both. And so with the questioner, where they, let me find where, excuse me. Let me pull this up really quick. So with our questioner, they are always the one that's going to be researching everything. They want to take time to weigh all of their options before they make up their mind. And they always want to, they want to have all the information, so they are making the very most right choice at all times. And I had a consultation with somebody who probably is a questioner, because she said it's very exhausting. Like, I can't make these decisions. I just research and I'm always afraid there's the next, like, right, most best decision out there. So I will just spend time researching. And so what will start to happen for them, like, that's such a gift and they become such a resource. We all want to go to the questioner. My sister would be an amazing example. Anytime she's a nutritionist. Anytime I have a question about anything health-wise, I'll go to her. She'll have an article for me within seconds. I feel like she always has articles on hand regarding some kind of information. And so they become such a great resource for all of us. But for them, they become very exhausted and become very paralyzed. They call it analysis paralysis, to where they're paralyzed in making those decisions and moving forward. And so for them, and it can come across as other people as like insubordination or disrespect. When my son is constantly questioning everything that I'm asking him to do, it can feel very disrespectful, like, please just stop fighting with me. When in reality, that's the hardwire of their brain, where they're always going back to, I need all the information before I will act on it. And so when they're looking at that, they'll always resist other people's expectations of them until they have information that is weighty enough for them to go ahead and move forward, and then to keep their self expectations. And so when I think about this, for every single one of us, and as parents, how do we deal with someone? And as you go through this, like, it's a very small section within the book. But what I loved is, as they talked about dealing with the questioner, for me, it's actually very easy to deal with a questioner because you can put a lot of the information on the line in the beginning. So for an example, my son just recently, sorry, I learned by a lot of examples. But so we have a rule just at our house where we don't have sleepovers. There's a lot of information about why we've made that decision. I won't go into it. I respect all parents' decisions. I'm not saying it's the right decision for everybody, but that was just a decision that we made for our family, is we don't do sleepovers. So he was at a birthday party, and half of the kids were having sleepovers, half of the kids were having late night. And he was very frustrated that he was in the half that was having a late night and wasn't able to sleep over. He questioned and questioned and questioned for an entire week leading up to this birthday party. And I kept trying to explain it. And finally, it got to the point where I was just tired of the questions. But when I picked him up from the party, the questions started again. And at that point, I finally said, okay, here is the research. I can find you articles to help you understand this, but the research is X, Y, and Z are more likely to happen at sleepovers. I said, in addition to that, when I was a young kid, this is something very bad that happened to me when I was away from my family, spending the night at somebody else's house. And so I put it so clearly. He was like, oh, okay. It's like, oh, I just need to say the word research, apparently, and he'll believe me. But it really was so fascinating to see all of a sudden, like, I had explained it, from my perspective, but I had never really put it into those, that clearly of words. And as soon as that happened, it was like his mind was like, okay, now I can accept that information as part of my research to answer this question. And so when we're talking with the questioners in our lives, that's what we want to make sure that we're bringing up is, hey, I need you to do this because of this. Like, give them a reason in order to do that. And then at that point, that's when they really start acting. They'll start not agreeing, like, it's not a way of manipulating, but that's where they'll start understanding and being able to work with that more. I'm trying to think if there was anything else. Oh, and just to really, and I find that, for those of us that meet expectations of others, is sometimes it is very challenging when they want to ignore arbitrary rules. But we can do our own thought work around that on it's really not that big of a deal. The examples that she used in the book is, arbitrary rules like you can only have 5 garments in the dressing room, but maybe you have 6. Now, for me, it's like, oh, I'll always leave that one out and then come out and get it and change something else. So I only have 5 at the same time. Whereas, the rebel or the questioner, they'll just hate those rules and just ignore them. They're not being dishonest. And, our job is not to judge them for it, but just to recognize that they, at this point, with a questioner, they don't have the information to really comply with that rule because it doesn't make sense to them unless they can see they're really busy or, are backed up on clothes or whatever. So just always recognize that we can release some of the judgments that we have, in some of these other, like an upholder, obliger, and be able to honor the gifts and the challenge, honor the gifts that the other tendencies do have. And so that's where I think that's about all in the book. And she leaves us with just at the very end, which I'm not going to read any of it just because we're short on time, but she says, speaking effectively to each tendency, this is where the power's at. As you learn the different tendencies, again, it's not to pigeonhole us into something, but to give us information so that we can thrive and within ourselves and the way that we exist in the world, the way our brain thinks, the way our body functions, And we can also help and speak to other people in the language that just makes sense to their brain. And as we do that, we become more effective leaders, we become more effective parents, we become better communicators in our marriage. All of those things start to happen. And so I do appreciate that she has a whole section about that. And I'll leave that to you on, how to really speak effectively to each tendency. So we do have, oh, sorry, Auntie, I missed that. I always say asked and answered when she repeats herself. Yes. So it'll be interesting as you watch her to see if she really falls into both of these categories, the rebel and questioner, or if she leans more towards one or the other as you've studied some of these. Okay, so for the last couple minutes, please go over to the chat box, or you can unmute yourself if you have any questions. I wanted to leave a couple minutes to talk about our upcoming 6 months and what books we want to be doing. I have a list of ideas that I wanted to run by you and to get your take, or if you have any other books that are on your mind that you would love for us to review. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so everybody can stay on, and then we'll talk about those books. So everybody that's listening on audio or at the YouTube channel, it was great to see you this month, and we'll see you again for our August book in just a couple weeks.